A Convert of the Mission, in selected stories by Bret Harte. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. A Convert of the Mission. The largest tent of the Tassajara camp meeting was crowded to its utmost extent. The excitement of that dense mass was at its highest pitch. The Reverend Stephen Masterton, the single erect, passionate figure of that confused medley of kneeling worshippers, had reached the culminating pitch of his irresistible exhortatory power. Sighs and groans were beginning to respond to his appeals, when the reverend brother was seen to lurch heavily forward and fall to the ground. At first the effect was that of a part of his performance. The groans redoubled, and 20 or 30 brethren threw themselves prostrate in humble imitation of the preacher. But Sister Deborah Stokes, perhaps through some special revelation of feminine intuition, grasped the fallen man, tore loose his black silk necktie, and dragged him free of the struggling, frantic crowd whose paroxysms he had just evoked. Howbeit he was pale and unconscious, and unable to continue the service. Even the next day, when he had slightly recovered, it was found that any attempt to renew his fervent exhortations produced the same disastrous result. A council was hurriedly held by the elders. In spite of the energetic protests of Sister Stokes, it was held that the Lord was wrestling with his spirit, and he was subjected to the same extraordinary treatment from the whole congregation that he himself had applied to them. Propped up, pale and trembling, in the mourner's bench by 2 brethren, he was striven with, exhorted, prayed over, and admonished until insensibility mercifully succeeded convulsions. Spiritual therapeutics having failed, he was turned over to the weak and carnal nursing of womenfolk. But after a month of incapacity, he was obliged to yield to the flesh, and in the local dialect, to use a doctor. It so chanced that the medical practitioner of the district was a man of large experience, of military training and plain speech. When, therefore, he one day found in his surgery a man of rude Western type, strong-limbed and sunburned, but trembling, hesitating, and neurotic in movement, after listening to his symptoms gravely, he asked abruptly, "And how much are you drinking now?" "I am a lifelong abstainer," stammered his patient in quivering indignation. But this was followed by another question, so frankly appalling to the hearer that he staggered to his feet. "I'm Stephen Masterton, known of men as a circuit preacher, of the Northern California district," he thundered, "and an enemy of the flesh in all its forms." "I beg your pardon," responded Dr. Duchesne grimly, "but as you are suffering from excessive and repeated excitation of the nervous system, and the depression following prolonged artificial exaltation, it makes little difference whether the cause be spiritual, as long as there is a certain physical effect upon your body, which I believe you have brought to me to cure. Now as to diet, you look all wrong there." "My food is of the simplest. I have no hankering for flesh pots," responded the patient. "I suppose you call saleratus bread and salt pork and flapjacks simple?" said the doctor coolly. "They are common enough, and if you were working with your muscles instead of your nerves, in that frame of yours, they might not hurt you. But you are suffering as much from eating more than you can digest as the veriest gourmand. You must stop all that. Go down to a quiet watering place for 2 months." "I go to a watering place?" interrupted Masterton. "To the haunt of the idle, the frivolous, and wanton? Never!" "Well, I'm not particular about a watering place," said the doctor with a shrug, "although a little idleness and frivolity with different food wouldn't hurt you. But you must go somewhere and change your habits and mode of life completely. I will find you some sleepy old Spanish town in the southern country where you can rest and diet. If this is distasteful to you," he continued grimly, "you can always call it a trial." Stephen Masterton may have thought so when, a week later, he found himself issuing from a rocky gorge into a rough, badly paved, hilly street, which seemed to be only a continuation of the mountain road itself. It broadened suddenly into a square or plaza, flanked on each side by an irregular row of yellowing adobe houses, with the inevitable veranda tienda in each corner, and the solitary galleried fonda, with a half-Moorish archway leading into an inner patio or courtyard in the center. The whole street stopped as usual at the very door of the mission church, a few hundred yards farther on, and under the shadow of the two belfry towers at each angle of the facade, as if this were the Ultima Thule of every traveler. But all that the eye rested on was ruined, worn, and crumbling. The adobe houses were cracked by the incessant sunshine of the half-year-long summer, or the more intermittent earthquake shock. The paved courtyard of the fonda was so uneven and sunken in the center that the lumbering wagon and faded diligencia stood on an incline, and the mules with difficulty kept their footing while being unladen. The whitened plaster had fallen from the feet of the two pillars that flanked the mission doorway like bandages from a gouty limb, leaving the reddish core of adobe visible. There were apparently as many broken tiles in the streets and alleys as there were on the heavy red roofs that everywhere asserted themselves, and even seemed to slide down the crumbling walls to the ground. There were hopeless gaps in grille and grating of doorways and windows, where the iron bars had dropped helplessly out, or were bent at different angles. The walls of the peaceful mission garden and the warlike presidio were alike lost in the escalading vines or leveled by the pushing boughs of gnarled pear and olive trees that now surmounted them. The dust lay thick and impalpable in hollow and gutter, and rose in little vapory clouds with a soft detonation at every stroke of his horse's hoofs. Over all this dust and ruin, idleness seemed to reign supreme. From the velvet-jacketed figures lounging motionless in the shadows of the open doorways, so motionless that only the lazy drift of cigarette smoke betokened their breathing, to the reclining peons in the shade of the catalpa, or the squatting Indians in the arroyo, all was sloth and dirt. The Reverend Stephen Masterton felt his throat swell with his old exhortative indignation. A gaudy yellow fan waved languidly in front of a black rose-crested head at a white-curtained window. He knew he was stifling with righteous wrath, and clapped his spurs to his horse. Nevertheless, in a few days, by the aid of a letter to the innkeeper, he was installed in a dilapidated adobe house, not unlike those he had seen, but situated in the outskirts and overlooking the garden and part of the refectory of the old mission. It had even a small garden of its own, if a strip of hot wall overburdened with yellow and white roses, a dozen straggling callias, a bank of heliotrope, and an almond tree could be called a garden. It had an open doorway, but so heavily recessed in the thick walls that it preserved seclusion, a sitting-room, and an alcoved bedroom with deep embrasured windows that however excluded the unwinking sunlight and kept an even monotone of shade. Strange to say, he found it cool, restful, and, in spite of the dust, absolutely clean, and, but for the scent of heliotrope, entirely inodorous. The dry air seemed to dissipate all noxious emanations and decay. The very dust itself, in its fine impalpability, was volatile with a spice-like piquancy, and left no stain. A wrinkled Indian woman, brown and veined like a tobacco leaf, ministered to his simple wants. But these wants had also been regulated by Dr. Duchesne. He found himself, with some grave doubts of his effeminacy, breakfasting on a single cup of chocolate instead of his usual bowl of molasses-sweetened coffee, crumbling a crisp tortilla instead of the heavy saleratus bread, greasy flapjack, or the lard-fried steak, and, more wonderful still, completing his repast with purple grapes from the mission wall. He could not deny that it was simple, that it was even refreshing and consistent with the climate and his surroundings. On the other hand, it was the frugal diet of the commonest peasant, and were not those peons slothful idolaters? At the end of the week, his correspondence being also restricted by his doctor to a few lines to himself regarding his progress, he wrote to that adviser: "The trembling and unquiet has almost ceased. I have less nightly turmoil and visions. My carnal appetite seems to be amply mollified and soothed by these viands, whatever may be their ultimate effect upon the weakness of our common sinful nature. But I should not be truthful to you if I did not warn you that I am viewing with the deepest spiritual concern a decided tendency toward sloth, and a folding of the hands over matters that often, I fear, are spiritual as well as temporal. I would ask you to consider, in a spirit of love, if it be not wise to rouse my apathetic flesh, so as to strive, even with the feeblest exhortations, against this sloth in others, if only to keep oneself from falling into the pit of easy indulgence.